ASP.NET Core 2.0 Web API quickly and differently. So there it is. Because of this error, I felt the need to make yet another .NET video because I felt that I had glossed over the solution just to get to doing it the right way. And now I'm thinking I should explain it a bit better so that you can understand what's really going on here. And since I don't feel like that's enough to justify a whole nother video in itself, I decided to change a few other things. For one, I'm using the very popular Visual Studio Code, and by that I mean I'm not using Visual Studio. And for that reason, I'll be using the .NET command line interface quite a bit more. As with most of my videos, I do this step by step and all from scratch so that you can follow along. Plus, I leave in a few errors and mistakes just so you can learn from them. That said, I do skip a few things. I don't show you how to install any software. I don't make a consumer for the web API. And for this reason, I don't need any cross-domain integration. For that, you can look at some of my other videos. While I was researching this video, I found this Microsoft page that's different from what I'm doing, but still you might find it useful. So yeah, with ASP.NET Core and Visual Studio Code, this could all be done from a Mac or Linux even. And now I'm going to wreck all that by making a database with Management Studio. But then again, I've heard Management Studio now runs on Macs and Linux. I haven't tried it myself. The reason I'm sticking with Management Studio is I've tried managing a database through a Visual Studio Code extension, and I didn't like it, and I don't really think it's worth it. I'm naming the database Organizer and adding one table called To Do. I'm just entering a few useful fields here for a to-do list. Now let's make a project folder. I open the folder and then get a DOS prompt by entering CMD in the address. Here's the help for .NET commands. I want to make a new project. In here is a list of project templates. The one I want is a web API, and the short name is web API. You can open the folder in Visual Studio Code right from here by entering code period. Choose yes for any missing assets. And I recommend installing the Microsoft C# extension, which I already have installed. Let's search for it. I see that this extension is recommended based on the files I have recently opened. It is by Microsoft, and you can see that I already have it installed. It should start without any changes, so let's give it a shot, and we don't need debugging yet, and it takes a little longer anyway, so let's start without it. Not found, and that's because we didn't enter an API path. Let's find out what that is from the controller. This first method here has a hard-coded return value. This entry here in square brackets is an attribute that is from this namespace. It has no attributes, which means that it's the default path for this class. The class has an attribute which uses part of the class name in the path. So the path is API values. And there are those hard-coded values. Let's stop that. Next, we want to connect to the database. So let's add a model plus a context for that model. For that, I'll use an integrated terminal, which I can get to by choosing terminal from here, or by choosing view, integrated terminal. So it's not found, and it would be great if I could use the .NET add package command, since that's something you might be familiar with, except that the thing we're missing is not a package, it's a CLI tool. So instead I'll have to edit the project file, which is this one. Here's another CLI tool. The tool namespace is named Microsoft.EntityFramework.Core.Tools.net. At this time, the latest version is 2.0.1. After that, restore the project. And there's the EF unicorn. And there's DbContext. The command I want is scaffold. Let's get some help. Here's the usage and the arguments. Let's break this down. So here's what the instruction should generally look like. And in our connection string, we want the name of the server plus the name of the database. And I'm not entering username and password, so in this case I need integrated security equals true. And the provider is this namespace for SQL Server. And I also want the results to go into the models folder, so I'll need this option as well. Unable to identify the primary key. Yep, I didn't make the ID field a primary key. So let's go back to Management Studio and script out a drop create. But before I do that, I'm going to delete this models folder that it just created. And while I'm in here, I'll make ID and identity so that it automatically gets a sequential value. That did it. And I can see the model and context in here. This warning message here is about having a hard-coded connection string. I'll deal with that later. So now we need a controller. This is where Visual Studio 2017 is much easier. I'll just demonstrate that. So So I've picked the type of controller that I want, and all I need to do is pick a model and a context, and it'll even make a context for you, and that's all you need to do. Before I do this, there's this reference in our project file that's not always there depending on the type of project you choose. So I'll remove it just so you see the error. I'll put it back. No code generators are available. Please add this package. That I can do. If it asks to restore for you, do it. And try again. If you recall, we're trying to generate a controller. Controller name is required. Okay, let's get some help. So here's the usage, plus it provided some options specific to controller. And here's some of the things we need. We need a controller name. That's what it was complaining about before. Plus I want, since this is an API, it'll be a REST with no views. And we also need the model and the context. Let's see, what else? Well, let's just break this down too. This time it's all options, and you can see how this kind of lines up with what we did in that Visual Studio dialog box, where we have a controller name that was entered for us in a dialog box, but we need a model and a context. And here's this the type of controller that we need, which is for an API, which if you recall from the help, that was a REST API without views. And then here we're giving it the path that we want to follow. Now, sometimes I find that the versions of these references don't always line up, and you'll get complaints for that, or it just won't work. And what I do sometimes, like I'm going to do here, is I just knock it down one. Usually I just, by going down it fixes it. And then you do a .NET restore. And now I'll run that controller generator instruction we just put together. And there's our new controller. Here's our class attributes. And here's our default method. You can tell by this attribute. So the path is API to do. Let's try it. And there's that error message. All right, let's take a closer look at that. Okay, so the key word here is service. When the controller is called, it's trying to get to the context as a service. So let's look at the controller, and I'll show you what I mean by that. There's a context property here that's set by the constructor, and the constructor has a context parameter, but we're not passing that parameter. If I search for DbController, you can see that it's not called from anywhere, and that's because the base class is an MVC controller. So before I get into the controller part of that, I should explain MVC. MVC stands for Model View Controller. There are so many variations of the MVC diagram, and I'll try not to add to the confusion here, but this one is fairly typical, except that that's not how I picture it in my head, because it's missing the context. So I see it more like this. And since we don't have a client for our web API, there is no view. So that covers MVC, but I still haven't explained what's wrong. So let's go back to the controller. If I comment out this MVC namespace, you can see that these attributes and this base class are all a part of it. And the controller base class passes the services requested into the constructor. In other words, it's using the dependency injection, which is another design pattern. So how do we fix this? Well, we can either create the service that's needed here or switch to a hard dependency. The hard dependency is quick. So let's try that first. So I'll get rid of this parameter here that it expects to be a service, and then create the object right here within the constructor. Whoops, it's empty. Let's insert a couple rows. Success. Okay, well, I would try some other methods, but I don't really feel like pulling up Postman. So that was easy, but clearly the code generator wants us to use dependency injection, whichever you prefer. This is a typical situation for dependency injection, so let's give that a try by switching that. So I put that service parameter back in, and now I will add the DbContext service by going to the place where services are added, which is configure services method in startup. And here is add DbContext, which is generic, so I'm missing a namespace here, so I can fix that by clicking the word and then clicking this light bulb and choosing using organizer models. You can see it just got added up here. I'll restart and refresh. So that works, and a refresh is all the testing I'm going to do for this. And Switching to a service now gets us one step closer to doing something about that hard-coded connection string, so let's look into that next. I know there's a get connection string instruction I can use, so I want to do something like this, and then use the string variable as a parameter, but I don't have a configuration object, so I'll have to build one. I'm missing another namespace. Another way of fixing this is to click the word and this time press Control period. And you can see it added another namespace up here. Okay, so that should do it, except it would build an empty configuration. And what I want is to add the app settings JSON file that's already in my project. That won't work without a base path. I added that missing namespace. I still need to put that connection string in app settings. In order for the generate connection string method to work, I have to code the JSON in this just right. And I need 2 slashes here. And now I can replace the hard-coded connection string with the string variable. Okay, so it still works, but I'm still not done. All we're doing with this override is getting the connection string, and it's kind of a waste building the configuration here since it's already built for us and available to us in the startup. The only question is, how do we get it into the context? Well, the DbContext service provides a way to pass settings. So the plan here is to replace the override with a constructor that can pass those settings along to the base class. But before I do that, I'll modify the service. Let me copy these lines here. This method offers options we can use in a Lambda. Include that namespace. And you can see from this that the connection string goes here. So now the connection string is in the service options and is available to the context constructor. We just have to pass it down to the base class. So I'll remove this override plus the system I/O and configuration namespaces we added earlier. To make a constructor, type CTOR tab. Tab again to enter the same name as the class. Tab again to enter the parameter. Since this is the constructor of a DbContext class, I can use DbContext options, which is generic, so use the class name again. This constructor really does nothing. It's just for passing the options down to the base class. Restart debugging and refresh browser. Done. Test complete. That's everything I plan to do. Let's wrap it up. I'm sure I could come up with a whole list of improvements, but this will do, and I'm not even going to go through these. So we accomplished a few things here. We developed our ASP.NET Core Web API in Visual Studio Code. We used the .NET code generators to make a model, a context, and a controller. Plus, and most important of all, we resolved that service for type DbContext error a couple different ways. And we moved our connection string into configurations. The end.